Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we are looking at conspiracy theories.
Yeah, you know those wild theories that try to explain things with like secret plots and hidden agendas?
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting? It seems like they're popping up more and more in the world of politics these days.
Yeah, especially with the election coming up, it seems like everyone's got a theory about something.
Right. Like, have you seen this whole thing about those old Baron Trump books?
Oh, yeah, that's a wild one. Some people think it's proof that Donald Trump and his son are like time travelers or something.
I know, right? Time travelers. It's pretty out there, but it's definitely got people talking.
Yeah.
So we've got a ton of different sources to dive into today.
Yeah, we've got news articles about those Baron Trump books, some articles about the psychology behind conspiracy theories, and even one that explores the actual science of time travel.
We're going to try and figure out why these theories are so captivating to people.
Yeah, and even more importantly, why they can actually be dangerous, especially right now with everything going on in politics.
Exactly. Because it's not just about harmless speculation. Sometimes these theories can have real-world consequences.
They can really impact people's beliefs, their behavior, even how they vote.
It's kind of funny at first, right? The whole idea of Donald Trump as a time traveler sounds almost ridiculous.
Right.
But then you start thinking about the bigger picture and it gets a little unsettling.
Yeah, it's a sign that facts and evidence don't seem to matter as much as they used to.
And that's scary because our society needs to be based on facts and shared understanding if we want to have productive discussions and make good decisions.
Exactly.
So let's start by talking about the psychology behind all of this. Why are people drawn to these theories? We found this article from the Boston Review that dives into that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. They talk about how conspiracy theories can give people a feeling of control in a world that often feels chaotic and confusing.
I can see that. When things are uncertain and you don't know what to believe, a simple explanation can be really tempting, even if it isn't totally true.
Yeah, and the article highlights how these theories often pop up during times of big social change or when people are feeling really anxious.
Like that example they gave about the rumor in Orléans, France in 1969.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
People were convinced that Jewish store owners were kidnapping women.
And that was happening during a time of a lot of social and economic change in France, right?
Exactly. So it shows you that people have been drawn to these kinds of narratives for a long time.
Yeah.
It's not just a modern internet phenomenon.
Right. These theories often tap into existing fears and anxieties and prejudices. They offer a simple black and white explanation for complex problems, which can be really divisive.
It's like creating an us versus them mentality.
Exactly.
And that brings us to how politicians are using these theories. We've got these articles from The Atlantic and The Washington Post that look at how politicians are actually using conspiracy theories to their advantage.
The Washington Post article mentions some pretty shocking examples from Donald Trump. Like, remember when he said that Haitian immigrants were eating pets?
Oh yeah, I remember that. Even some people in his own party thought that was too far.
It was pretty outrageous. And that's what makes these tactics so effective. They tap into people's existing fears and prejudices and create this sense of urgency and outrage.
Right, it's like they're trying to rile people up.
Exactly. And the Atlantic article even suggests that Trump is setting the stage to challenge the election results if he loses.
Like he's already planting the seeds of doubt.
Yeah, potentially even trying to justify violence if things don't go his way.
That's a scary thought. But it's important that we understand how these tactics work so we can be more aware and protect ourselves from being manipulated.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's circle back to this Baron Trump time travel theory. What do you actually make of all that? Is there any real evidence to back it up, or is it just a bunch of coincidences and wishful thinking?
Well, the news articles we looked at lay out the basic details.
Hmm.
These 19th century books do feature a character named Baron Trump, and there are a few superficial similarities to Donald Trump and his family.
But it seems pretty far-fetched, right?
Yeah, the connections are really flimsy. They rely on vague interpretations and taking things out of context.
Right, and then we've got this YouTube video that really goes all in on the theory, even linking it to Nikola Tesla.
I mean, it's an entertaining video, but it's important to remember that not everything you see online is true.
You always have to be skeptical, right?
Yeah.
Especially with stuff like this.
Exactly. The internet is full of misinformation, and these videos are often designed to be more about entertainment than facts.
They play on our curiosity and our desire for something exciting.
Yeah, and sometimes the truth gets lost in the process.
So as a listener, how do you even tell the difference between a real theory and one that's just designed to get clicks and views?
That's a great question, and something we'll be exploring more as we go deeper into this topic. But one thing to watch out for is sources that rely more on emotion and speculation than actual evidence and logic.
So think critically and don't just believe everything you see and hear.
Right. It's also important to ask yourself who's spreading this information and what their motivations might be.
That's a really good point. Speaking of evidence and logic, let's shift gears for a minute and talk about actual time travel. The kind that scientists and physicists think about. We've got this article that explains the ideas of closed time-like curves and how gravity can affect time.
Oh, yeah. That stuff is mind-bending.
It is. But it's also really fascinating. So, from a scientific perspective, is time travel to the past even possible?
Well, the article suggests that it's highly unlikely, bordering on impossible.
So no hopping in a DeLorean and going back to the dinosaur era.
Afraid not. But the idea of closed time-like curves is still intriguing, even if we don't have any proof that they exist.
And even if they did, the technology to manipulate them and create a time machine is way beyond anything we have today.
Right. We're not even close.
Okay, so time travel to the past might be a fantasy, but what about traveling to the future? Is that something that's actually possible?
Well, the article suggests that traveling to the future is theoretically possible. It's not as flashy as going back in time, but it's still pretty cool.
How would that even work?
Well, remember Einstein's theory of relativity?
Vaguely.
Well, one of the things it tells us is that gravity can warp time. The stronger the gravitational field, the slower time passes relative to someone in a weaker gravitational field.
So if I spend some time near a black hole, I could come back to Earth and everyone I know would be older than me.
Exactly. Of course, the time difference would be tiny unless you got really close to the black hole, which is probably not the best vacation spot.
Good point. But still, it's a wild concept to think about.
It is. And it shows you that while time travel to the past might be a fantasy, the science behind time dilation is real.
It makes you wonder about the nature of time itself.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing.
Okay, so we've talked about why people believe in conspiracy theories, how politicians are using them, and even the science of time travel. But the big question is, what can we do about it? How do we stop the spread of misinformation and prevent ourselves from falling for these harmful narratives?
That's what we'll be digging into next. And the good news is that there are things we can do to make our society more resilient and less susceptible to falling for these easy answers and fear-mongering tactics.
Sounds like a plan. We'll be right back after a quick break.
See you soon. So before the break, we were talking about how to deal with this whole problem of misinformation and all these conspiracy theories floating around.
Right, because it can feel overwhelming sometimes, like where do you even start?
Exactly. And that's why this report from the European Union is so interesting. They're not just focusing on debunking individual theories.
Which would be impossible.
Right.
There are just too many of them.
Right. They're looking at broader strategies. And one of the most interesting ones is this idea of pre-bunking.
Pre-bunking. Okay, that sounds kind of complicated.
No, it's actually pretty simple. It's like a vaccine for misinformation.
Oh, okay, I get it.
So instead of waiting for people to come across a conspiracy theory and then trying to debunk it, you give them the tools to spot it ahead of time.
So you're like preparing their immune system to fight off the misinformation virus.
Exactly. You teach them about the common tactics that these theories use so they can recognize the warning signs.
Like the lack of evidence or the emotional manipulation?
Yeah, exactly. Or the tendency to blame everything on some secret group or shadowy figure.
So if you come across a video claiming that the election was rigged, for example,
Right.
you'd be more likely to question it, to look for evidence, to consider other explanations.
Exactly. You'd be more skeptical and less likely to just accept it at face value.
That's a really cool idea. It's like
Yeah.
teaching people to be better critical thinkers.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
And the report also talks about the importance of media literacy.
Which is basically understanding how information is produced and shared right.
Yeah, and how it can be manipulated. We need to be aware of the biases of different sources and learn how to evaluate information critically.
It's not just about conspiracy theories either, right? These skills are important for navigating the world in general.
Absolutely. We're bombarded with information all the time, and we need to be able to filter through it and figure out what's reliable.
Okay, so pre-bunking and media literacy, those are two big strategies. But what about censorship? Doesn't that seem like the most obvious way to stop the spread of these theories?
Well, the report actually cautions against censorship as a primary strategy.
Really? Why is that?
Well, for one thing, it can backfire. It can make people feel like they are being silenced, which can actually reinforce their belief in the conspiracy.
It's like that whole forbidden fruit thing, right? The more you try to suppress something, the more appealing it becomes.
Exactly. And it also doesn't address the underlying reasons why people are drawn to these theories in the first place.
So if we shouldn't censor these theories, what can we do to prevent them from spreading and causing harm?
Well, the report talks about creating a more resilient society, one that's less susceptible to falling for these narratives,
And how do we do that?
by addressing the things that make people vulnerable to these theories in the first place.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, we talked earlier about anxieties about economic instability, social upheaval, a sense of powerlessness. When people feel like they have no control over their lives, they're more likely to seek out explanations that give them a sense of order and agency.
Even if those explanations aren't based on reality.
Exactly. So it's not just about debunking individual theories. It's about creating a society where people feel more secure, more connected, and more empowered.
So it's a much bigger challenge than just fact-checking a few Facebook posts.
Right. It requires a multi-pronged approach. We need education, media, literacy, critical thinking skills, and we need to address the root causes of social and political instability.
It's a tall order, but it's important work.
Hmm.
And if we can create a society that's more resilient to misinformation, we'll be better equipped to deal with all sorts of challenges.
Absolutely. And it starts with each of us being more mindful about the information we consume and share.
Right? We all have a responsibility to be critical thinkers and to engage in respectful dialogue, even when we disagree. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to talk about the ethical implications of all this. We've talked about the psychology and the politics, but is there a point where these theories cross a line from being just misguided or harmful to being actually dangerous?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is definitely yes. When conspiracy theories lead to violence, discrimination, or other forms of harm, they are no longer just harmless speculation.
Right, like that Pizzagate incident a few years ago where a man showed up at a pizza restaurant with a gun because he believed there was a child sex trafficking ring operating there.
Exactly. That was a terrifying example of how these beliefs can have real-world consequences, even if they seem outlandish to most people.
So we need to be aware of the potential for harm and speak out against these theories when they start to cross that line.
Absolutely. We can't just dismiss them as harmless fun.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the psychology of conspiracy theories, the ways they're being used as political tools, and even the science of time travel. But for our listeners out there, what are some key takeaways you can apply to your own lives?
You know, we've been talking a lot about the dangers of misinformation and conspiracy theories, but it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract problem.
Right, these theories have real-world consequences.
They can erode trust in institutions, lead to violence, and make it almost impossible to have reasonable discussions about important issues.
And with the election coming up, I'm particularly worried about the impact these theories could have on our democracy.
Yeah, that's a huge concern. When people start to believe that the system is rigged or that their vote doesn't matter, it undermines the entire foundation of a functioning democracy.
And it seems like some politicians are actively encouraging these beliefs.
Unfortunately, you're right. They spread misinformation and sow distrust in order to manipulate voters, justify undemocratic actions, and even challenge legitimate election results.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves from falling for these theories.
Yeah.
It's about protecting our democracy as a whole.
Exactly. And one of the most important things we can do is be mindful of the information we consume and share, especially during an election.
It's so easy to get caught up in the outrage cycle. You know, you see a headline that makes you angry and you share it without even thinking about whether it's true.
Right, but we have to resist that urge. We need to take a moment to pause, question our assumptions, and consider the source of the information.
We have to be skeptical and do our own research, especially with information online.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to disagree with people without demonizing them. Just because someone has different political views doesn't mean they're part of some evil conspiracy.
We need to be able to have respectful conversations even when we disagree.
That's crucial for a healthy democracy. And it's something we need to work on both individually and as a society.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for joining us and for engaging in this important conversation.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, critical thinking, respectful dialogue, and a commitment to truth are more important now than ever.
We all have a role to play in combating misinformation and protecting our democracy. So let's go out there and be forces for good in the world.